Hello. This is a re-recording of the talk that I gave yesterday at Stanford during the celebrations for the 75th anniversary of the Stanford Research Park. It's a brief summary of the history of Silicon Valley, and in the second part, I try to emphasize what is really special, in my opinion, and why it happened in the Bay Area and not in other places of the world. I wrote a 500-page, co-wrote originally a 500-page history of Silicon Valley that was translated also in Chinese and was way more successful in China than in the United States. Any book on Silicon Valley, on the history of Silicon Valley, typically has four starting points. And that there's no founder, but quote unquote founders of Silicon Valley are considered Leland Stanford, who started Stanford University. Stanford University was a minor university for a long time, so I think it's far-fetched to think of him as the initiator. Fred Thurman is a more valid starting point. William Shockley also valid starting point, and DARPA, the Defense Department agency that funded the development of advanced weapons, can be considered the first venture capitalist of Silicon Valley in a sense, um, um, because it's the one that started funding developments in electronics. Thurman is important for many reasons, but in particular, he encouraged Stanford students to start their own companies. And here you see the Varian brothers and then Hewlett and Packard. Um, Before I go any further, it's important to realize back then, the center of high-tech research, of research on electronic um, technology in general and electronic computing in particular, was not in California, was not anywhere near California. Boston was probably the number one place. At one point, there were such huge projects that Boston had the vast majority of software engineers in the world. Philadelphia was a historical place for research on electronic computing. And of course, Bell Labs, Bell Labs in New Jersey, and New York State in general. In Europe, Britain, Cambridge was the place where one of the very early computers was invented and the place where the first commercial one was introduced. IBM was in New York State, and so on. Anyway, Fred Thurman was instrumental in creating the Stanford Industrial Park in 1951. The idea was very simple. The land of Stanford was to be leased only to high-tech companies, and these are the first tenants. And then we had the first high-tech IPOs of the Bay Area, Varian in 56 and Hewlett Packard in 57. In parallel, William Shockley opened his lab between Palo Alto and Mountain View. Shockley was one of the three inventors of the transistor, and he moved back to Palo Alto for family reasons. 8 of his engineers started Fairchild Semiconductors, which can be considered the first venture-funded startup company of the Bay Area, and many of its employees went on to start other semiconductors companies in the area. And the next slide is a family tree that I stole from a famous book. Important to note that at that point, the main customers for semiconductors was really just the military and NASA. And this is, you can find many of these family trees that shows of Fairchild, and the companies started by engineers, executives, salesmen of Fairchild. And some of them still exist, are pretty big, Intel, AMD, and so on. Again, let's not forget the context. The mainframe computer was invented by IBM, and then it had competitors in the United States, also in Japan and Europe. And the big electronic um, business and research was happening far away from California. What was happening in California? I single out two things that, in my opinion, um, are the embryonic spirit of Silicon Valley. At SRI, which originally was a spin-off of Stanford, a man called Doug Engelbart created a graphical user interface and a hypertext system. He also used the first mouse, and he connected all of this to a remote computer. And at SRI also, the scientist developed the first robot that you would call a robot that was actually moving around. And nearby, Zero Spark had a group of very creative young engineers who started thinking about computing for the masses. And the next slides have pictures, historical pictures. This is Doug Engelbart and the so-called mother of all demos in December 1968, where he had two computers talk to each other between San Francisco and Menlo Park with a graphical user interface and so on. Today sounds trivial, back then it was sensational. And this is the group at Zero Spark that worked on a computer for a desk, sitting on a desk. Now, on the left, you see the typical computer of the age, colossal machine occupying a colossal building. And on the right, you see the demo of the Alto, the computer they developed. So they had the idea to put a computer on a desk. And for whom? For school children. 1971 is when Intel introduces the microprocessor, which is a very teeny device that is as powerful as the first major computer developed by von Neumann and collaborators. Now, Intel cannot really take credit for that invention because the executive thought of the microprocessor as simply one of the many things that would help sell memories. Memory was the business, the big business of Fairchild and Intel. And then a humble employee at California State University in Sacramento built a computer around a microprocessor. So it proved an important concept. And then, of course, Intel came up with better microprocessors. But who really jump-started the idea of building computers, microcomputers with microprocessors? It was really the community of hobbyists, magazines, journalists, store owners, typical grassroots movement that grows just because there are a bunch of um, young engineers working at home on their projects and creating clubs. And the most famous club was the Homebrew Computer Club that was meeting nearby at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. Now, note that IBM was a colossus, and its competitors were also very big companies. They had obviously the know-how, the talent, and the factories to make desktop computers if they wanted, but they didn't. The whole idea of the home computer was created by hobbyists. And of course, the famous one is the Apple II. Wozniak was a member of the homebrew club from the beginning, and they showed the first Apple there. The Apple II was the one that was successful, thanks mostly to this piece of software called the VisiCalc. And the VisiCalc really proved an important point, the value of software. And in fact, what happens next in Silicon Valley has less and less to do with silicon and more to do with software. And even here on this slide, you see the workstations. The workstations were important because they were running Unix, the Unix operating system. So lots of progress. in software. And then in the 90s, the World Wide Web changes the world, invented in Switzerland. The first browser, um, Mosaic, was renamed Netscape when the inventor moved to Silicon Valley. 1995, the boom of the dot-coms begins with the Netscape IPO. And then this is some of the historical dot-coms. And this lasts until 1999, and then 2000, the market crashed. When the market crashed, a lot of these companies went disappeared. But nonetheless, after the crash, actually Silicon Valley got even bigger because you have PayPal, Facebook, um, and eventually the iPhone, Android, uh, Airbnb, Uber, and so on. And the secret of the success was really the idea that products have to be free. Then I will go very quickly through the 2010s, 2020s. Silicon Valley explodes, valuation go through the roof. And in red, I wrote the milestone of artificial intelligence, which at the time were not really appreciated. OpenAI was founded in 2015. Hardly anybody knew about them. 2017, Google introduced a transformer model, very important, but very few people paid attention. And in the 2020s, people start paying attention to artificial intelligence. And so Silicon Valley becomes more of an AI valley today. So that's the official history of Silicon Valley. You can find the details in my 500-page book or in many other books on Silicon Valley. What I want to do is a different kind of history now, because being from Europe and having studied ancient civilizations and, of course, the Renaissance, um, all these things, all the things where there were booms of creativity were unlikely places. If you only look at the history as a linear history of science technology, as a straight line, it's hard to go from Egypt to ancient Greece to eventually the Renaissance in Florence and so on. And it's very unlikely that you get to Silicon Valley. So in 1971, that's when Silicon Valley really becomes famous after the introduction of the microprocessor. So what was famous in the Bay Area before 1971? If you ask somebody in the 60s, what do you know about the Bay Area? And nobody would answer technology and science. They would answer that there were colonies of crazy artists and crazy writers and crazy musicians. They would answer the student riots of 1964 that predates the more famous ones in Europe. They would answer the hippies of 1966-67 and many other unusual phenomena. They would not point to technology and science. So the Bay Area, the Society of the Bay Area, was really famous for something completely different. So now let's look at the map today. On the right, you have the map that I made with OpenAI, Anthropic, LinkedIn, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, Facebook, Google, Intel, NVIDIA, and so on. And on the left, there's a picture of Santa Clara County in 1950. It's not just orchards and deserts, but pretty much. So how did you go from the left to the right? And if you focus on the world of the 1950s, the Bay Area is a very unlikely place. The technology, the money, and the brains were on the East Coast and in Europe. The great universities, MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, that's East Coast. Or in Europe, Cambridge, Oxford. The great electronics labs, Bell Labs, RCA, IBM, it's all East Coast, and some in Europe. Nobel Prizes, France, Britain, Germany, and universities of the East Coast. So the Bay Area is very far from where the money, the technology, and the brains were back then. Now, most books, this is my diagram, and most books have diagrams like this that explain how Silicon Valley works. The universities, graduate students start companies, venture capitalists invest, some of the successful startup founders become venture capitalists, and so on. Now, this diagram has been replicated all over the world, all over America, all over Europe, all over China, and so on. Still, there's only one Silicon Valley. So there's something special about the society here that cannot be easily replicated even in the rest of America. So let's start with what Silicon Valley does best. And as I travel around the world, people tell me, well, Silicon Valley is a place of inventors. Well, surprise. These are things that were not invented in Silicon Valley. The computer, the transistor, robots, artificial intelligence, programming languages, databases, World Wide Web, search engines. I can go on, all the way to generative AI. They were not invented here. In fact, I can tell you where they were invented, and most of them were invented very far from the Bay Area. So what is really special about the Bay Area if we don't invent? Well, we like the word disrupt, and that's the right word, because we didn't invent the personal computer, but certainly the Apple II and other personal computers in the Bay Area were different. We didn't invent the search engine. Certainly Google was different. We didn't invent the sharing economy, but Uber and Airbnb were different. Facebook was not the first social network, but certainly it was different. And ChatGPT was not the first chatbot, but certainly it was different. So what Silicon Valley does really well is take an invention, which in most cases is coming from somewhere else, and twist it, disrupt it in a way that eventually changes the world. And so this is the favorite example, the picture I showed you. Computers were colossal in 1970. But these kids with long hair and zero spark thought, I want to put that big thing called computer, I want to put it on a desk. And for whom? For school children. That's disruption. Now, the other thing that is important to notice is where does this disruption come from usually? Now, if I have to mention innovations that came from big companies in Silicon Valley, I can come up with two, the iPhone and the Transformer. Apple and Google were already big when they introduced this. But if I think of everything else, from the microprocessor to the GUI, biotech, e-commerce, search engines, GPU, all the way to generative AI, all of these disruptions came from small companies. So that's another thing that is typical here. It's really about small companies. And every 4 or 5 years, somebody tells me that the big companies have killed the ability of small companies to emerge. And sure enough, somebody comes up, and recently it's OpenAI and Anthropic. So that's still true today, no matter how big the big ones are. Now, then open source was very important since the time I came here in the 80s. Of course, today GitHub is the big open source repository, 180 million developers. But if you go back to the 80s, this was quite common in 80s, 90s. It was quite common in the Bay Area that software would circulate, that there was this kind of collaboration, actually. And if you look at what open source gave us, big data, deep learning, the Android operating system, the Firefox browser, and the infrastructure of the internet, and language models, all the way to OpenClaw. Then, of course, immigrants. There's no other place in the world, in my opinion, that is as cosmopolitan as the Bay Area. And the contribution of immigrants has been colossal. Just think of AI. These are some, not all, but some of the most important innovators in modern AI. And look at where they were born or grew up, literally all over the world. In fact, the people born and raised in the United States are a minority um, among founders and engineers of Silicon Valley. Think of the founders of Google, Nvidia, Tesla, richest man in the world. People think it's a Silicon Valley character. It's from South Africa and so on. And then if you also count second generation immigrants, oh my God, the list would be infinite. Then, of course, it's a place for young people. Venture capitalists love to talk to young people who have crazy ideas. And venture capitalists don't like so much to talk to middle-aged CEOs who have been very successful, but they're not the disruptors. They're not the typical disruptor. And so this is a place where we have billionaires, self-made billionaires, very young. Mark Zuckerberg was a sensation when he became a billionaire at the age of 23, while his record has been beaten recently by three kids, the founders of Mercor, who became billionaires at the age of 22. And finally, I want to emphasize the passion for impossible projects. All of these things on this slide were considered impossible when they were made. Let's put on a computer on a desk. Let's have computers talk to each other. Let's index the whole World Wide Web. Let's have a self-driving car, and let's have computers that talk fluent English. So all of this was impossible, but all of this is really the spirit of Silicon Valley. If you have an idea that is a slight improvement over what exists, you don't get a lot of traction in Silicon Valley. Your peers will not be impressed. Venture capitalists will not be impressed. But if you have an idea that has never been done before, or that sounds really, really crazy, I think you get a lot of attention from both the society and the investors. And if it's impossible, you get even more attention. If it's impossible, it means you don't have competitors. So that's very much the history of Silicon Valley. Now, going back to the Bay Area before it became famous as Silicon Valley, what I just told you about the real special attributes of Silicon Valley, the disruption, the passion for impossible projects, the contribution of young immigrants, and so on. It doesn't really correlate with what was happening on the East Coast and in Europe, but it correlates with what was happening in the society of the Bay Area before 1971. I think the real secret of Silicon Valley and the reason that nobody else has been able to replicate Silicon Valley is really the society that had such unique phenomena. Thank you very much.